Hello, everyone. My name is Naeem Dargout from the Electricity Markets and Policy Group at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, and I'd like to thank you all for joining the webinar today, where we'll be summarizing the principal findings from our latest Tracking the Sun report. It's the 6th edition of this annual report funded by the U.S. Department of Energy's Solar and Energy Technologies Office. So a few notes on the mechanics of the webinar. So throughout the presentation, all participants will be in listen-only mode. We'll have a question and answer session following the presentation, and you can enter questions throughout the webinar by using the chat feature, which is located at the bottom left corner of your screen. This webinar is being recorded on August 16th, 2013. So now I'd like to introduce our main speaker, Galen Barbotes, also in the Electricity Markets and Policy Group at LBL, who's first author on the report. Galen?
All right, thanks, Naeem. Thanks, everyone, for joining us here today. So I'm going to just dig into the report here momentarily. I did want to sort of forewarn all of you that it may be a bit of a flood of data and information that I'll be throwing your way. And so I did want to let you know ahead of time that the report and presentation are both available online. And the last slide in the presentation will have the web addresses where you can download those documents. And in addition, we'll be posting a recording of this webinar online as well. So if you want to come back and re-listen to anything that you might have missed, that will also be available. So before jumping in, I did want to just make a couple important acknowledgments. One being to acknowledge my co-authors on this report. You heard from Naeem, and in addition, Samantha Weaver and Ryan Weiser were also important contributors here. And so you can consider me to be speaking on behalf of the team here. And again, I just wanted to acknowledge the Department of Energy's Solar Energy Technologies Office as the funder for this work. So to begin, Tracking the Sun is very much a data-driven report. It's focused on describing and analyzing historical trends in the installed price of PV in the United States. In essence, we have just this very large data sample of operational projects, which I'll describe in several slides. And the purpose of this report is fundamentally just to slice those data in as many interesting ways as we can. And listed here on this slide are some of the dimensions along which we look at this data in the report. We won't unfortunately have time to go through all of these elements within the 1-hour webinar here. And so the grayed out bullet points at the bottom of the slide are things that we'll unfortunately have to skip. But of course, if you're interested in them, again, the full report and a fuller version of this briefing with those results are both available online. So first I'd like to just give a bit of background on the data sample itself and on a few key methodological items, and then we can launch into the numbers. So first, just to make sure that nobody gets hung up on the terminology here, the report is focused really exclusively on the installed price of PV, and by that we mean the upfront purchase price paid to the installer or the integrator prior to receipt of any incentives. And this is expressed throughout the report in terms of dollars per watt. The other definitional issue here pertains to our distinction between residential and commercial PV on the one hand and utility scale PV on the other. By residential and commercial PV, we are referring specifically to roof-mounted systems of any size, plus ground-mounted systems up to 2 megawatts, and then correspondingly, utility scale simply refers to ground-mounted systems larger than 2 megawatts. There's no particularly profound reason for why we drew the distinction this way. It was really just kind of a practical distinction, and certainly there are other definitions out there that are in use and that are probably equally or more valid. But for better or for worse, that's the way that we've kind of cut up the data along customer segment lines. With respect to data sources, the residential and commercial PV data are sourced primarily from state and utility PV incentive programs, and there were 47 such programs that contributed data to this edition of the report. The utility scale PV data are derived from a more varied set of sources, including FERC Form 1, the Section 1603 grant program, other kinds of regulatory filings, and even news articles and trade press articles where available. As any of you know who have worked with large data sets, it's never as simple as just getting the data, and there's always quite a bit of work involved in transforming the data and cleaning it and doing all sorts of quality control. This slide here just highlights a few of the critical elements in that process, which are, of course, detailed more fully in the report itself. I'll just verbally mention a few of the things on this slide. First, all of the dollar values presented here are in real 2012 dollars, and the system size data are in DC watts. So everywhere where we present dollar per watt figures, those are real 2012 dollars per DC watts. And then the second point that I'll make, and this pertains to the circled bullet item, when pulling the data set together, we attempted to remove all of the third-party owned systems where we deemed it likely that the reported installed price data were actually appraised values rather than an actual transaction price. And this is a bit of an esoteric issue. I'll come back to it later, but the important point to just recognize up front is that there was a subset of the third-party owned systems that we pulled out of the data and that are excluded from the figures that we'll be showing here shortly. And then the last prefatory remark that I want to make before really getting into the data is just to highlight a few caveats, and these are probably somewhat self-evident, but I think are nonetheless important to acknowledge. And the first of these is just that these data are historical, and they focus specifically on systems installed through year-end 2012, and therefore may and most likely do differ from the price of systems that are going into the ground today or that are being quoted today. And so one just has to be careful about not making that equivalence, given particularly how dynamic the PV market in the US is and how quickly prices are moving. Second, and somewhat related, there are lots of PV pricing benchmarks out there that may or may not agree with the data that I'll be presenting here momentarily. And I just wanted to sort of make the general point that any disagreement that might exist between those benchmarks and these data don't mean that somebody's wrong or that there's some fundamental inconsistency, but really, in many cases, it may simply reflect some underlying definitional differences or differences in what those benchmarks are intended to represent. So again, some caution is just necessary when making those kinds of comparisons. And then the last thing I'll mention is just that this work is, again, really singularly focused on the upfront installed price of PV. However, what one often cares more about, especially from a policy perspective or from a cost-benefit perspective, is the levelized cost of electricity, the LCOE. And that is important both because it captures differences in upfront costs as well as differences in costs over time and differences in project performance. And so I wanted to, again, sort of acknowledge the limitation in the metric that we're presenting here, even though it certainly is useful for many purposes. It's not sort of an all-encompassing measure of the cost of solar energy. So with all that background of the way, let me start going through the data itself. The figure here simply compares our data sample to the overall population of PV installed in the US, and is really simply intended to convey that the sample that we have really represents a pretty large share of all PV systems in the US. In total, we have installed price data on more than 200,000 individual systems. And those systems collectively represent about 72% of all grid-connected PV capacity installed in the US through the end of last year. Here we see how the residential commercial PV sample is distributed geographically and also how it's distributed by system size. And these trends largely, though by no means perfectly, reflect the distribution for the larger population. On the left, we see that California represents the largest share of the residential and commercial PV sample, about 50% of all of the cumulative capacity, and about 40% of the systems installed in 2012. And this is out of a total of 29 states that are represented within the data set. The other big states in the sample include most of the usual suspects: New Jersey, Arizona, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and New York. The two major state markets that are missing from the data sample are Hawaii and Colorado. And that's simply because project-level data from those states just isn't available. We were, however, able to obtain some summary data for Colorado that was incorporated into one portion of the analysis that we'll see later. And then last, on the upper right, we see that the vast majority of systems in the sample by count are relatively small systems. About 85% are below 10 kilowatts in size. But then, of course, when looking at the distribution in terms of capacity, it's obviously much more evenly distributed across system sizes. Residential and commercial PV systems in the data sample, as in the broader population, have been getting larger over time, and we see that here, where, for example, in 1998, 100% of the capacity in the sample consisted of systems smaller than 100 kilowatts, while in 2012, the bulk of the capacity in that year, installed in that year, consisted of systems larger than 100 kilowatts. And obviously, here we're only looking at residential commercial systems. If we were to roll utility scale into these tabulations, the trend would even be more dramatic. Here we see a similar set of figures as before, but for the utility scale data. We have a total of 190 utility-scale PV systems in the data sample. Those systems are spread across 19 states. Most of that capacity, however, is located in the 8 states that are shown in the pie chart on the left. And this is basically the desert Southwest plus New Jersey and North Carolina. And then with respect to the size of the systems, as you recall, we defined utility scale PV to consist of ground-mounted systems larger than 2 megawatts. So obviously all of the utility scale systems are larger than that size. However, most of the systems are relatively small compared to what many may think as typical of utility scale. So specifically about 3/4 of the systems in our utility scale sample are smaller than 10 megawatts, that is between 2 and 10 megawatts. Most of the utility scale capacity, however, consists of projects larger than that size. So let's now turn to really the real focus of this work, which is to describe installed price trends. And we'll start with the trends for residential and commercial PV. And then after that, we'll separately address utility scale PV. Here we see the long-term trend in median installed prices over time, broken out into the 3 system size ranges shown. I mean, there are several key points to observe here. First, over the entirety of the historical period, we can see that installed prices have fallen quite considerably, with an average annual decline of about 6 to 7% per year. However, those price declines have occurred to some degree in kind of fits and starts over that period, where you can see a prolonged period from about 2004 through 2008, 2009, where there was very little movement in installed prices. And this corresponded to a time when globally PV demand was ramping up very rapidly, and was outstripping the capacity of suppliers to meet that demand. And this was when, for example, we saw the big surge in prices for raw polysilicon. Since 2009, though, we've seen very precipitous declines in installed prices, and we'll talk in the next few slides about some of the macro dynamics underlying that trend. In just the last year of the analysis period, from 2011 to 2012, median installed prices fell by about 30 to 90 cents per watt, or 6 to 14%, depending on system size. And the text box on the lower right of the figure identifies the median installed prices for systems installed in 2012, which you can see range from $5.30 per watt for systems less than 10 kW. So that's mostly residential, but some small commercial systems there as well, down to $4.60 per watt for systems larger than 100 kW. A couple important things to keep in mind when thinking about those numbers. First is that those median values are central tendencies. And we'll show in great detail in a few slides that there's really tremendous variability within the sample around those medians. And then the other important thing to keep in mind is that the sample, as we saw, is pretty heavily dominated by California. And as we'll show again in a few slides, California is a relatively high-cost state. And that obviously tends to then pull the overall sample, the installed price for the overall sample upward. In general, the focus of this latest iteration of Tracking the Sun is on systems that were installed through year-end 2012. We are, of course, now more than halfway through 2013, and so one might reasonably wonder what has happened in the intervening time. So to give some preliminary indication of that, the figure here compares the installed price of systems installed during the first half of 2013 to the price of systems installed throughout 2012, focusing just on data from the California Solar Initiative Program, CSI. And what we see here is that installed prices in this program have continued to fall pretty significantly over the first half of the year, in particular by 10 to 15%, depending upon which of the three system size ranges you're looking at here. And so to the extent that these trends are representative of the rest of the country and that they hold up throughout the remainder of the year, then we would actually be on pace to exceed the installed price reductions that we saw last year. There are, of course, the mitigating factors, namely that module prices have begun to stabilize and even creep upwards in some markets. However, there is often a bit of a lag between movements in module prices and installed system prices, and so there still may be some residual system price reduction based just on the declines in module prices that have occurred up until this point. And then, of course, there are non-module costs which also may continue to decline and that would therefore enable further continuation of system-level price reductions throughout this year. So I just sort of referred in passing to the role of module prices in contributing to system-level price reductions. And here we see that, in fact, the installed price reductions over the past 4 to 5 years are primarily attributable to falling module prices. And the figure here focuses specifically on systems less than 10 kW in size, where the top line in the figure shows median installed prices for this size class. This is the same data that was on the figure 2 slides ago. And then the bottom blue line is a global module price index. So taking that index as a proxy for the underlying module costs of the systems in our data sample, we can estimate that about 80% of the total system-level installed price reductions since 2008 are associated with falling module prices. Though certainly, I think you can see in just sort of lining up the blue and the green lines that the movements in module prices and system prices haven't necessarily moved in perfect lockstep, but clearly there is a very clear and obvious correlation there. Also shown on the figure in the orange dashed line is what we call the implied non-module costs. This is just the calculated residual term, what you get when you subtract the module price index from the total installed price, and effectively includes all of the hardware costs other than the module, plus the various business process and soft costs as well. And so you can see that over the entirety of the historical period shown here, going back to 1998, we can see that these non-module costs in aggregate have proceeded in somewhat undulating fashion, I suppose, with a net reduction of about $2.50 per watt over that full period. And so clearly, non-module cost reductions have been an important contributor to total system-level price reductions over the long term. Over the past decade or so, however, those non-module costs have remained somewhat stagnant. And as a result, we've seen really an increasing emphasis on those costs and on soft costs in particular as they've become an increasing portion of the total system costs. So one other macro level dynamic that I think forms an important part of the overall context here is the decline, the decline in installed prices has occurred in tandem with a drop in the incentives that are provided through state and utility PV incentive programs. Those incentives have, of course, been falling in part as a result of the drop in installed prices, and also as a result of the growth or emergence of other kinds of financial incentives, such as the federal ITC and solar renewable energy certificate markets. The causal relationship probably also works a bit in the opposite direction as well, where incentive program administrators have ratcheted down incentives specifically for the purpose of encouraging further reductions in installed prices, either by kind of trying to stimulate greater efficiency among installers and within the supply chain, and by sort of trying to squeeze out as much of the margin as they can. Whatever the cause, though, the end result is that from the customer's perspective, these incentive reductions have to some extent offset the installed price reductions. And so, for example, over the past decade or so, where you can see just this very steady decline in the state and utility cash incentives, over that period, we see that the median incentive levels fell by about $3 to $3.50 per watt, which equates to about 80%, or a little bit more than 80% of the drop in installed prices over that period. So the preceding figure that we were just looking at focused just on one piece of the incentive pie, namely the cash incentives provided through state and utility incentive programs. So those are, of course, basically rebates and performance-based incentives. I mentioned also the emergence of solar renewable energy certificate, or SREC markets, as another type of incentive out there that to some extent has sort of supplanted those traditional rebate programs. The figure here shows prices in those SREC markets and how they've evolved over time. I won't really say much here other than simply to note that these SREC prices have also fallen considerably in recent years. And so just as the drop in the cash incentives from state and utility programs has served to sort of mute and offset the impact of falling PV prices, so too has this drop in SREC prices. So turning to a bit of an international comparison here, notwithstanding the fact that we've seen some pretty significant installed price reductions in the U.S., PV system prices here are still quite a bit higher than in some of the other major international PV markets. And the figure here focuses just on small residential systems, the reason there being that that's the size range where we could get sort of the most comparable data across countries. And it compares prices for within that system size range, focusing on systems installed in 2012 and on a pre-sales tax or pre-VAT basis. And we see that indeed prices for U.S. systems in this size class are higher than really in all of the other countries shown here except Japan, with the greatest disparity in comparison to Germany, where prices were basically half the level as in the U.S. Now, most of the underlying hardware costs are effectively global commodities with pretty marginal price differences across countries. And so it therefore kind of stands to reason that much of the variation that we're seeing in terms of total installed prices across countries can be attributed to differences in soft costs. And those differences in soft costs may in turn be partly attributable to differences in the size of each market. And this is kind of on the theory that larger markets allow for greater economies of scale and greater efficiencies. And that theory is perhaps partially borne out by the data, where we see by the blue bars in the figure that both Germany and Italy have amassed much larger volume of PV installations in the U.S. At the same time, I'd say it's probably safe to say that this is not the whole story, and that there are really a wide variety of other drivers for these cross-country international differences. And indeed, the fact that Australia, which on the right-hand side you can see is a relatively small market in absolute terms, the fact that they had much lower installed prices than the U.S. Suggests that larger market size alone, at least in terms of absolute volume, really does not and could not account for the entirety of the installed price differences that we're seeing here. So as we saw on the last slide, the pricing differences between with the U.S. were the most stark in comparison to Germany. And here we simply elaborate a little bit more on that point by comparing the installed prices across a wider range of system sizes, again on a pre-sales tax basis. And really the only additional point I want to make here is just simply to note that those pricing disparities that we saw on the last slide for small residential systems persist across a wider range of system sizes, and you can see that here. And for those of you that are interested in digging into these trends a bit further, I'd encourage you to take a look at a briefing that we put out earlier this year that really focuses specifically on the U.S. versus Germany price comparison and tries to kind of unpack and decompose the overall gap in soft costs between these two countries and explain it in terms of its constituent elements. And so the last slide in the presentation has a link to our full publications page where you can find that briefing if you're interested. So far, we've been looking just at median values, at the central tendencies. And as I mentioned, there is just quite a tremendous amount of variability around those medians, and we see that quite clearly here. So the figures here are histograms showing the installed price distribution for systems installed during different time periods. The figure on the top is for systems less than 10 kW. The one on the bottom is for systems greater than 100 kW. And we can see a few consistent trends here. The first and most obvious is that these distributions have shifted to the left over time. And this is basically just corresponds to the decline in median prices that we saw on some of the earlier time trend slides. Second, we see that the distributions have narrowed somewhat, particularly during the earlier periods. For example, if you compare the histograms for the 1998 to 2003 period, the green lines to the blue lines for the 2004 to 2009 period, you can see that narrowing pretty clearly there. And that narrowing could be interpreted as indicative of a maturing market where there's increasing competition among suppliers and better informed customers. We see, however, that this narrowing trend has largely stalled during the past few years, and that a quite significant degree of variability in pricing has persisted. And so, for example, as I noted previously, the median installed price for less than 10 kW systems in 2012 was $5.30 per watt. But as we see in the top figure here, about 20% of the systems in that size range had a price less than $4.50, and another 20% were priced higher than $6.50. So really a very wide range in prices. There are lots of potential contributors to this variability. Certainly some of it relates to differences in the characteristics of the project, the kinds of technologies used, local market conditions, attributes of the installers, and so forth. Suffice to say, there are likely lots of underlying drivers here, and probably no one single thing contributes to most of this variability. Now, throughout the remainder of this presentation, we'll start to pick apart this variability a little bit and look at some of the specific individual issues that contribute to this price dispersion. I'll also mention that we're currently engaged in a separate project that is digging into these data with some more sophisticated statistical techniques in order to kind of more rigorously isolate the causes of this variability. So more research is being done in this area. For our present purposes, however, I'd just like to emphasize two key takeaway messages here. The first is that one needs to be really careful and specific when referring to the installed price of PV, as clearly there's no single price that characterizes the market as a whole. It's really this wide price distribution. And then the second key takeaway is that the wide variability in pricing that we currently observe does suggest that they're oops, excuse me, I thought I lost my connection here. The second key takeaway message here is that this wide variability that we're seeing does suggest that there are ample opportunities to identify best practices and lessons learned within the current market if we want to identify opportunities for more widespread cost reductions. As we would expect, installed prices exhibit economies of scale with respect to system size, and we see that in the figure here, which focuses just on residential and commercial projects installed in 2012 and breaks the data out into some narrower size ranges than we showed before. The charts here show the median values and the 20th and 80th percentile values, and this is kind of the structure that many of the following charts will have as well. So the figure on the top covers all residential commercial projects from 2012. The one on the bottom basically just zooms in on the less than 10 kW system size range. And so not surprisingly, what we see in both figures is a continuous decline in installed prices as system size increases. The one interesting thing to note, though, is how rapidly those returns to scale diminish, where we see median prices drop off quite quickly at the smallest end of the spectrum, up to say 5 kilowatts or so. But the economies of scale then really taper off after that point. And there are certainly folks, I think, who could explain better than I can the underlying mechanics here that explain the shape of those scale economies. But one potential policy implication is that there does seem to be a fairly significant cost advantage to ensuring that residential customers aren't overly constrained in the size of the systems that they can install, at least up to, say, about 5 kilowatts or so. One other implication of this trend that I'll just briefly mention is that because residential systems have gotten larger over time, from about 2.5 kilowatts in 1998 to now somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 kilowatts. Because of that, that sort of partly explains the overall decline in median installed prices for the less than 10 kW group, because you basically sort of had a shifting in the size of the systems within that size range. So the US PV market is somewhat fragmented into a large number of regional and state and more local markets. And this fragmentation occurs both by virtue just of the large geography of the U.S., as well as due to the tremendous variation in policy and regulations that exist from one place to another. And the figures here help to reveal the impact of some of those geographical differences by breaking apart the data by state, again focusing on 2012 installations, summarizing the data in terms of medians and percentiles. In both the top figure, which focuses on less than 10 kW systems, and the bottom figure for greater than 100 kW systems, we see quite substantial differences across states. These differences reflect many of the same kinds of issues that I mentioned in passing several slides ago. One specific hypothesis that has often been proposed is that prices could be higher in states with higher incentives or higher retail electricity rates if installers are able to kind of value price their systems. In other words, price their systems based upon the value that they provide to the customer rather than the underlying cost. So that's one hypothesis. In addition, there are, of course, differences across states in labor costs, differences in permitting and other kinds of administrative costs. Sales tax differences can contribute to up to about 40 cents per watt. So that is yet another driver for these cross-state differences. And then, of course, there's simply the size and maturity of the market, where we'd expect larger markets to have lower prices by virtue of having greater competition and efficiency and more bulk purchasing and better access to low-cost products. That last factor is most certainly real, I would say, though I would mention that the largest state market, California, actually has relatively high prices, as you can see here. I asserted that earlier, and we can see it here. And this is why, as I mentioned, the dominance of California within the data sample tends to pull the overall sample median upward. And so again, it's just important to be specific when referring to the installed price of PV about what part of the U.S. one's talking about. We need to take a small detour here to talk a little bit about how installed prices are reported for third-party owned systems. Third-party ownership of course, refers to the arrangement where the site host doesn't own the PV system, but instead either leases the system or purchases the power from the system via a separate entity. And as many of you are no doubt aware, third-party ownership has really taken off in recent years and is now really the primary ownership model in a number of states. The issue here from the perspective of tracking installed prices is that the data collected for third-party owned systems doesn't necessarily represent the exact same thing as for customer-owned systems. And specifically, we can distinguish between two basic kinds of third-party ownership models which use different conventions when reporting installed price data to the incentive programs that then in turn provide us data for this report. So the first kind of TPO model is where you have an integrated company that both installs the system and also provides the customer financing. And in these cases, there's no sale of the system per se, or at least no arm's length transaction from which a meaningful sale price could be reported. And so instead, what gets reported in these cases is some kind of appraised value. And so as I mentioned on the methodology slide at the beginning of the presentation, we've removed these systems from our data sample to the extent possible in order to kind of avoid polluting the overall analysis with a bunch of numbers that really weren't comparable to the rest of the data set. Now then there's a different kind of TPO model where instead you have one company that performs the installation, and that company then sells the system itself to a customer finance provider who turns around and leases the system back to the site host. And unlike the first integrated TPO model, in this non-integrated case, there actually is an arm's length transaction where ownership of the system changes hands, and it's the sale price from that transaction that then gets reported to the PV incentive programs. And so for the purpose of our analysis, we consider those transactions to be similar enough to the transactions that occur for customer-owned systems, and so we therefore retain those systems in the data sample. So just to confirm that the TPO systems that we've retained haven't created any undue distortion in the trends, here we compare those systems to the customer-owned systems, and we can see that indeed the prices between these two groups are in fact quite similar. This is actually, to some extent, a bit surprising, or at least it was to me, as I think one might expect these TPO systems to be a bit less expensive, considering that the purchasers in these cases are customer finance providers who have a lot of experience and knowledge and would presumably be able to extract quite competitive prices from installers. At the same time, however, if the lease rates that the finance providers are able to charge are sufficiently high, that they're able to make their targeted return, then perhaps that might dampen some of their negotiating power. And then I guess in thinking about it further, perhaps more fundamentally, if you're an installer who can either sell the system to the site host outright or sell it to a lease provider, there's probably not much incentive to accept a lower price from the lease provider than what could be obtained by selling the system to the site host. So in some sense, the prices for customer-owned systems serve as really a kind of a proxy or benchmark for what an installer might be willing to sell the system for if selling it to a finance provider. One other and somewhat subtle trend illustrated in the figure here is that the variability in pricing, which is shown by the percentile bands, is a bit narrower for TPO systems than for customer-owned systems. And this is more or less as we'd expect, as you often see finance providers purchasing bundles of systems from an individual EPC contractor for some kind of standard price, and perhaps that standard price was established through a framework agreement of some sort. So within the report, we've cut the residential and commercial PV data in lots of additional ways according to technology types and customer types and different kinds of applications such as new construction versus retrofit. Unfortunately, I don't have time to cover all that material here, It's in the report, and it's in the larger briefing that's also posted online. I did just want to give one example here. And this example breaks the data out according to whether the system uses a microinverter or a standard central or string inverter. As many of you likely know, microinverters have become increasingly popular in recent years, especially among smaller systems. And the advantage, or one key advantage of microinverters is that they allow the system to operate at higher performance. By virtue of being able to control the operation of each panel independently. The downside, of course, is that microinverters currently cost a bit more than standard inverters. I think it's about maybe 30 to 40 cent per watt differential between microinverter and a standard inverter. And then separate from the cost difference of the inverter itself, microinverters can also indirectly impact other balance of systems costs like installation labor and system design costs. And those impacts might potentially go in either direction, either positive or negative. And so given this multitude of potential cost impacts, both direct and indirect, we thought it might be useful to see the net impact of microinverters on the total system installed price. And that's what the figure here attempts to show. In particular, what we see is that among systems less than 10 kW in size, those with microinverters had had a median installed price about 40 cents per watt higher than those with central inverters, which is actually, roughly equal to the difference in the cost of the inverter itself. And so one implication of this price differential is that the increasing market penetration of microinverters, at least among systems in this size range, has probably dampened, albeit fairly modestly, but slightly dampened the overall decline in installed prices for systems in this size range. In contrast, looking at the larger systems shown here, the 10 to 100 kilowatt systems, we actually see the opposite relationship, though the absolute magnitude is a bit smaller. One has to be a bit careful in generalizing too much here, but this might suggest that among this system size range, microinverters actually yield a significant enough savings on other balance of systems costs to more than offset the higher price of the microinverter itself. Obviously, this is the kind of conclusion that is always useful to corroborate with some bottom-up engineering analysis. So one should kind of be careful about extrapolating from this, but that is potentially one interpretation. So let's switch gears now and quickly look at some installed price trends for utility scale PV. There are a number of caveats specific to the utility scale data, which I've listed here. I'll just very quickly run through them. The first is that we are dealing with a relatively small sample size, and that's just for the simple reason that there just aren't a large number of utility scale projects operating in the US. The second is that we report installed price trends based on the date of installation. And in some cases, there could be a bit of a lag between that date and the time that the price for the project was agreed upon. Third, the data sources here are somewhat more varied than for the residential and commercial data. We've obviously tried to only include data that seem trustworthy, but nevertheless, there is some irreducible level of uncertainty in the reliability of some of these data sources. And then last, I'll just mention again that we're focusing here on the upfront installed price, not the levelized cost, and that especially for utility scale PV, levelized cost is really a more meaningful metric when considering sort of the relative economics of different resource options. So here we see essentially all of the individual utility scale systems in the data set, where we've organized them by year along the x-axis and then grouped them according to the system configuration type. Looking initially just at the 2012 systems on the right-hand side, we can see the capacity-weighted average installed price for each of the three system configurations. And those capacity-weighted averages were $3.30 a watt for crystal and fixed tilt, $3.60 a watt for crystalline with tracking, and then $3.20 for thin film. I'll make the same point here as with the residential and commercial systems, and that's that these are, of course, central tendencies, and as you can see here, there's quite a bit of variability that exists around those averages. And you can see that especially with the crystalline fixed tilt systems, where you've got prices ranging from $2.30 all the way up to $6.80 per watt in 2012. As far as discerning a meaningful time trend, it can be a bit challenging with this data, just given the small and somewhat diverse sample of projects. If we just focus initially on the crystalline fixed tilt systems, the orange dots, we can see that the capacity-weighted average prices fell by about $2.80 a watt over the entire historical period shown. But those price reductions really slowed pretty considerably within the last year of the analysis period, where we saw just about a 20-cent per watt decline from 2011 to 2012. And that year-over-year price decline is actually quite similar to what we saw among the commercial systems larger than 100 kilowatts. Looking at the thin film systems, the blue triangles, we see that the capacity-weighted average installed prices there really barely changed at all over the historical period, and in fact were slightly higher in 2012 than during the 2007 to 2009 period. We've got obviously small sample sizes here, so some caution, of course, is warranted. But nevertheless, if you look at that time trend for the thin film systems compared to the time trend for the crystalline systems, you can really see how the relative economics of those two different system types has changed over time, with really the sizable price advantage that thin film systems enjoyed essentially evaporating over the span of this period. The utility scale systems in the data set include a wide range of system sizes from 2 megawatts all the way up to 60 megawatts. And that, of course, contributes to some extent to the overall variability in pricing that we observe among these systems. So to help visualize that, the figure on this slide breaks apart the 2012 utility scale data by system size. And as you can see, for example, the projects larger than 10 megawatts are much more tightly clustered within a range of say, basically $2.50 to $4 per watt. The smaller projects, less than 10 megawatts, are actually also clustered more or less within the same band, but then they have this long upward tail. With about 20% of the systems priced above $4 and even a few above $5 a watt. And so the bottom line here is that just much of the overall variability that we see for the utility scale data set is really limited to these relatively small utility scale projects, less than 10 megawatts. And then the figure here also helps to just reinforce what we saw on the previous slide in terms of the relationships across the different system configuration types. And in particular, you can see that the crystalline systems with tracking are, as we'd expect, somewhat higher priced than the similarly sized systems without tracking. So we're at the end of the presentation here, and I thought I would just end by summarizing a few of the big picture points and offering maybe some general kind of policy implications. The first general point here is that the installed price of PV in the U.S. has, as we've seen, declined quite substantially over time, but both the pace and the source of those price reductions have varied. And in particular, over the past 5 years or so, the installed price reductions have been driven primarily by a drop in global module prices. Now, there are some basic mathematical, if not economic and engineering limits as to how much further module prices could conceivably decline. And so it therefore stands to reason that further reductions in system-level prices are going to have to come primarily from the soft cost side. And as we've seen, those soft costs do tend to be quite stubborn. The good news is that we have really a wealth of experience and examples to draw from to help identify potential near-term opportunities for reducing soft costs. And those examples and experience exist both outside of the U.S. in some of the lower-priced international markets like Germany, as well as within the U.S. and within some of the low-priced states in the U.S. So there are examples to look for. I'd say that you know, as a rule, one has to be somewhat careful about presupposing how to get from here to there. I would say, though, that it's quite likely that soft cost reductions will in part just arise naturally by virtue of increased deployment scale. And that happens just as market participants become more efficient and more competitive and the economies of scale grow within the delivery chain. At the same time, however, I think the experience that we've seen so far also seems to suggest that a more refined approach may be needed than simply driving deployment scale by any means necessary, and that the most effective way to drive soft cost reductions is to achieve that deployment scale through some set of relatively stable and straightforward value propositions for the customer, and to perhaps do that in combination with some set of targeted policies aimed at specific soft costs, along with R&D efforts that might yield the kind of breakthroughs that could dramatically change the way that PV systems are sold and installed. So with that, I'd like to thank all of you. As I mentioned, here are the web links where you can download the report, a larger briefing, a data file, as well as the link to the full set of our group's renewable energy publications, where you can, for example, find the US versus Germany comparison that I mentioned. And then finally, our contact information if you'd like to reach any of us to further follow up. So with that, I realize we don't have a huge amount of time left for Q&A, but I have been seeing lots of questions pop in as I've been talking. So I think what I'll do is I'll turn it back to Naeem, and Naeem, you can read off any questions that we have time for, and I'll do my best to answer them.
Sure, and yeah, we probably have time for just a couple of questions. A couple of people asked on if you could give a few more words on this deep dive project that you had mentioned at the beginning.
Yeah, sure. So we're currently engaged in a multi-year project with a team of academic university researchers that will entail, or is entailing, taking the Tracking the Sun data set, which is this very large and rich data set with many fields that we're not even using, combining that with lots of other data, demographic data, and so forth, and running a bunch of regression analyses to try to really isolate the key underlying explanatory variables for that wide variability in system pricing that we see. And of course, the objective here is not simply to understand this variability from a theoretical or conceptual perspective, but is to really hopefully identify some sources for this variability that are actually amenable to policy, so that this information could then be used really to kind of stimulate and drive further cost reductions in a targeted way.
Great. We also have a question on how we choose which programs are included in the data set, and why some programs are missing. Someone pointed out that Hawaii isn't included.
Yeah, sure. So I mean, we're as inclusive as we can be. We really kind of are willing to accept data from any program, as long as it has kind of a minimally requisite number of data fields. The issue with Hawaii is that the incentive program there is the state tax credit, and they don't collect data on system pricing. So unlike say the California Solar Initiative or any of these rebate programs, those programs require that participants provide data on the price of the system. The program in Hawaii, it doesn't, and that's really just by virtue of the kind of program that it is. So that's the only reason why it's excluded.
Just a couple clarification questions. One, what does the installed price include? So inverters, permitting costs, taxes, and what does it not include? Perhaps incentives, tax credits, etc.
Yeah. Well, so the installed price, it includes really is whatever the installer can get it to include. I mean, this is the transaction price that's negotiated between the buyer and the seller to exchange a piece of property. And if you're the installer, you want that price to cover all of your costs for the project, the cost of goods sold, plus enough of a gross margin to cover your overhead costs and earn some kind of profit. But of course, you know, the prices are set to some extent based on supply and demand, and so for any given transaction, the installed price may be well more than the necessary amount that the installer needs or less than the necessary amount. It really just depends on kind of market conditions and the negotiating power of the two counterparties.
Great. Well, I think we're approaching the top of the hour, and we unfortunately didn't get to every question. I did try and answer some questions individually also. Do feel free to email us with if you have more questions. Also refer to the report, which has much more detail. Well, thank you all for joining us again, and we are going to be ending the call.